This is Euroscopic, your weekly roundup of what happened, what's happening, and what might happen in and to Europe. In partnership with EU Observer, we bring you insights and reporting from their people on the ground across the European Union and beyond. I'm Wayne Bluecroft, a journalist based in Berlin and writer of the Germany Substack newsletter called The Schland.
And I'm Martin Gack, also based in Berlin, Germany, and the author of Inconclusive Thoughts.
We are recording on Monday, February 19th. We will be discussing the new EU Red Sea mission, more Russian sanctions possibly on the table, bilateral Ukraine agreements. Of course, I will have some takeaways from the Munich Security Conference later in the show. And given when we're recording, as always, events may have changed by the time you hear this episode, wherever your ears go for podcasts.
Ahead in this episode, we'll be talking to Anton Shekhovtsov, a contributor to the EU Observer and also a scholar in Vienna. And later in the show, we will also be talking to Ian Bremmer, who, just like William here, has just returned from the Munich Security Conference to see what are his takeaways, conclusions, and perhaps to shed a little light on what has been otherwise apparently a very somber occasion. Is that right, William?
Oh, it was somber, reflective, and as always, very self-involved, shall we say.
So that's later in the show. But first, what do you have for this week, William?
Right. Well, I am coming out of this vortex that is the Munich Security Conference, so I'm trying to remember a world beyond that. Of course, so much is connected to it. Leading into the Munich Security Conference, we, of course, had this flurry of bilateral agreements that Ukraine signed with a variety of European countries, France, Germany, the UK. I find these bilateral agreements fascinating, and the statements and sort of the spin around them. Of course, leaders always want to put the best foot forward, want to make the most positive case for whatever policy they're putting forward. But it is almost, in my sense, in acknowledgement, I won't say defeat, I think that's too strong, but an acknowledgement of problems, right? That it's getting harder and harder to find this multilateral common voice that we saw a year ago, or certainly in the immediate aftermath of Russia's invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It's getting harder to keep that coalition together. So you're resorting to plan B, which is making these bilateral agreements that can maybe go faster because you only have one party to deal with and not 10 or 20 or 50, as in the case of the Ukraine Contact Group. I'm estimating there, of course. I can speak most authoritatively to the German one. It's an interesting document, and it's public. It's in English as well for those who can't speak German, so anyone can go to the German government website and read the document for themselves. On one hand, it does, put its money where its mouth is and commit a lot of aid and support to Ukraine over a 10-year period. The agreement's for 10 years. On the other hand, it's not very clear, and we're hearing this from other places, it's not very clear what exactly the objective is, what victory means when talking about if Ukraine is under threat, or in the event of another show of aggression from Russia. And I think, well, wait a minute, there's a current show of aggression from Russia. That's not ending. So the wording is very, very interesting about which I think tells us a lot about fears about where things are going with Ukraine, the lack of U.S. support, regardless if Donald Trump is president or not. There's an isolationist streak and a pro-Russia or Russia-friendlier streak in U.S. politics. So a lot of it is an acknowledgement, a kind of a realpolitik view of where things are or might be heading with Ukraine.
To some degree, it does look from the distance as a consolation prize of sorts.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Particularly, I mean, in the context of a flurry of talk about the Ukraine candidacy for NATO being now within reach, which in my mind remains nonsense. But the conversation is being had, or the noise is there. On my part, I'm actually paying quite a bit of attention at Poland this week because there's been.
Because you love pierogies, that's why.
I love pierogies, I love gołąbki, and I actually really like Warsaw itself, not the weather. But it turns out that this week there is a parliamentary investigation into the use of Pegasus, which is an Israeli spy software that was deployed by the previous government, not completely clear against whom, but very likely against opposition and independent journalists. This is obviously a further attempt at sort of, pegging blame, political blame, etc., on the previous government, the PIS. What is interesting about this case is that it might really have European-wide ramifications, because the fact is that the Israeli contracting of this software, which emanates actually from essentially an industry very, very close to the Israeli government, the deployment of this software has been, it seems, European-wide. It's not clear how many governments and how far have actually deployed this, but presumably we're going to hear a bit about this kind of thing over the next couple of months as this inquiry continues to unfold, because obviously one of the questions that very likely will be dealt with is, how is it exactly that Pegasus got into Polish hands or the hands of the Polish government?
Right. And it's also part of this larger purge of the new government of Donald Tusk to sort of erase the legacy of the PIS in Polish politics. And I think to sort of safeguard against them coming back, or something even more, illiberal coming back or after them. I think they're trying to maybe future-proof Polish democracy. Is that maybe too much of a stretch?
I mean, I don't think that. So the two things to say is, I don't think that would be a remedy to the PIS. I mean, reading them of Pegasus or spying software. The other and the bigger question is, this Polish government remains perfectly friendly to Israel, perfectly friendly to its contractors, and at the very same time, I do not foresee Tusk ridding himself of very powerful weapons to actually look into what is that actually the PIS is doing. Although, of course, this is just pure speculation. But I mean, if the tool is powerful enough, then there would be good reasons for the Polish government to want to keep it. But again, I think it's important to emphasize that this is not a Polish story. This really is not just a European story. It's much broader, because it seems that this software, which actually can hack into private phones, has actually been deployed quite widely.
Right. So, it was a big story, when it first broke, and I'm sure it's still coursing through many of our phones. Hopefully not mine, but we would never really know. It hasn't gone away.
What other story do you have?
Well, just today, the foreign ministers, the EU's foreign ministers, met and approved an EU naval campaign in the Red Sea to protect shipping lanes against the Houthi attacks. Of course, the Houthis have been launching attacks against various Western shipping, military and civilian, in their alliance with Hamas, in opposition to Israel's bombing of Gaza. One of the many chess pieces in that region that risks spilling over and escalation into much even scarier things, what we're seeing already, if that's even a possibility. But I guess things could always get worse. What I found interesting is that it's the foreign ministers that approve ostensibly a military mission. It's not the defense ministers. I think that speaks volumes to how the EU sees itself, and brings up those questions that we and others are asking about what is the defense posture of the European Union. You would think this would be a military matter, although as we see in many member states, the militarification of foreign affairs, that you see foreign ministries, Annalena Baerbock, over the course of the Munich Security Conference, she herself came out and said, we need to spend more on military. We need bigger defense budgets. We need to beef up our defenses. So even foreign ministers, whose job ostensibly is the opposite of the military, it's peace, it's diplomacy, even they are getting into the military game. But that could very well be to fill the gap left by the lack of defense thinking and military thinking in and around the EU.
Meanwhile, in Brussels, the idea of actually a commission precisely dealing with defense issues is apparently gaining traction. In any case, the other big story that happened at the beginning of right before actually the MSC began, was the announcement of the death of Alexei Navalny in Russia, in essentially what is a gulag, so a penal colony far in the Arctic Circle. We're going to be discussing precisely that story, its implications, and the kind of message that it sends right ahead. Here we have with us Anton Shihobtov, who is the director of the Center for Democratic Integrity in Vienna. He's also a visiting professor at the Central European University. And he is an author, also a contributor at the European EU Observer, who focuses on far right and its connection to Russia. Thank you for being with us, Anton.
Thank you, Martin, for having me.
A lot of this weekend really started around Thursday, Friday, when we heard that Alexei Navalny had died in Russian detention. And strangely, it seems to go without saying for most of the international press that Navalny was killed by Putin and his operatives. I guess the first question that I have for you is, what do you make of the timing of his death, and how do you read this?
Martin, I do believe it's a tricky question about the timing, because as we know, the Kremlin had started, had begun trying to kill Navalny several years ago already. It's just, thanks to the Russian emergency doctors, thanks to German doctors, and probably even luck, that Navalny survived an attempt on his life using this nerve agent Novichok several years ago. So what happened now, I think, was in a way finally carried out, but the order had been given several years ago. I don't think that there is some thoughts or considerations in the Kremlin about the timing, because the conditions in which Navalny was held in that prison camp or that penal colony, it could have happened any time. The conditions did not give him any chance of surviving, and again, given his history of this poisoning, how it affected his general health, again, it could have happened any time. So I would be cautious about talking or discussing the actual timing, whether the Munich conference, the security conference, or even the Russian presidential election, or so-called Russian presidential elections.
Anton, I'm wondering how we should best understand Navalny and his legacy. He was a very imperfect person by any measure. And it seems like in a moment like this, it becomes either or. In order to criticize Vladimir Putin, you have to mythologize and lionize Alexei Navalny.
Of course, he had his shortcomings. I think the most important thing about Alexei Navalny, and this is something that I think his legacy, it will be 100% his legacy, is that his activism, his belief that a different Russia is possible, gave many people hope that at some point, maybe at some point in the future, Russia could go or could take a different path. From the reports that we have in the media and elsewhere, there were also parts of the Putin regime who had that hope that Navalny could become just a symbol of a different Russia at some point in Russia's history, and that is now gone. Yeah, and Navalny took this with him. I don't really want to go too much into discussion about the sort of shortcomings of Navalny and his movement, but it was such an important symbol, personal symbol, that somehow also undermined the strength of his movement. And it's not a given that Navalny's movement can survive his death.
On that note, how do you see this post-Navalny Russia? What do you think that happens to other opposition figures? I mean, some very prominent ones like Kara-Murza, who is actually in confinement. How do you think that this period looks? Do you think that we are now at the end of any serious opposition to Putin?
Navalny was, I would say, the only active Russian politician in opposition to the Kremlin regime who still lived in Russia. And his return to Russia, that was a controversial move on his part, but that was also part of this whole vision of his vision of Russia. Yeah, if you're a Russian politician, you have to be in Russia, despite all odds. So the majority, of course, now of Russian opposition activists, they are emigres. Yeah, they emigrated from Russia because they feared for their life, and that is quite substantiated fear. So you still have people like Vladimir Kara-Murza and Ilya Yashin and some others being in jail. I do believe that with the death of Navalny, unfortunately, now the Kremlin basically has no, red lines. Yeah, I guess also that Vladimir Kara-Murza is probably not in the condition as bad as Navalny was, but something similar. What the Kremlin is doing is that this is basically just a slow death. This is just a slow execution with tortures. They want to break people. They want to just annihilate them, and the slow nature of that execution is also a message to Russian opposition figures that something like this can also happen to you. And because probably you're not as famous as Navalny, nobody will even think about you outside of your own family and social circles. I also think that the Kremlin, after the so-called elections in March this year, it may become even more repressive. Probably also a new wave of mobilization will be announced. Putin doesn't want to do it before the election because now the Kremlin's objective is, of course, to say and then present this idea that everything is proceeding according to the plan. So there is no need to mobilize more people. But after the elections, they will have an opportunity to say, well, now we can do some even more drastic, or take even more drastic measures concerning the mobilization for the war.
So it sounds like a consolidation of Putin's power, even less of an understanding or a vision of what a post-Putin Russia could ever look like. Although Vladimir Putin is human, as far as you know, he has to die at some point, even if he's never overthrown. And you're shifting away, and I'm glad you are. You're shifting away to the broader aspects of Putin's policy and his interests, especially in regards to Ukraine. And when I was at the Munich Security Conference, I'd heard a lot of contradictory statements. It seems like in the West, pro-Ukrainian people who want to stand up to Putin and keep fighting for Ukraine, they seem to have difficulty acknowledging that time is on Putin's side, but at the same time don't seem to know what to do about that. What is your assessment on where things stand now with Ukraine?
Time is on Putin's side, still considering that he's a human being. Yeah. But there is another thing that I would add to this. It's not only that time is on his side. What is also on his side is this a historical mission that he chose for himself. A historical mission of a ruler of Russia that made Russia a country which everyone around is basically afraid of. Yeah? This is a very Soviet understanding of what the great power is about, and Putin is building into this image, into this perspective. In his recent speeches, that he will compulsively deliver a historical lecture to any audience that he talks to, and you also see that he is considering what is happening now. He's considering it as an eternal fight, eternal war between the West and Russia, or between the West and the East, and then Russia is representing that East. So he's talking in historical terms. He's talking in terms of centuries, even probably millennia. This is his obsession, and a person who thinks in centuries, who thinks even in millennia, who thinks of this eternal war is extremely dangerous. This obsession makes him very very unpredictable in a way. So on the one hand, yes, we can predict that he will continue the fight. There is no way for him to back out. There is no way for him to end what he is doing, because this is his mission. This is he built this mission for himself, and he will not stop on his own. There are on the Western side, there are very few people with this historical understanding of what is going on or what the product is we're talking about. Of course, now you will hear European politicians, European leaders saying that this period of peace is over. We are moving into this multipolar world, and multipolar world will automatically mean more conflicts, more rising powers, reclaiming what they thought is theirs, reanimating some historical traumas, reanimating past conflicts. So this is a very, very dangerous time. And I do believe that we need to think about what is happening in Ukraine, but also elsewhere in Europe, from this perspective, that Putin is willing and he has time on his side to reconfigure the international world order.
Anton, thank you very, very much for your insights. We really appreciate visiting us. Of course, the invitation is always open for you to drop by.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Ian Bremmer, president and founder of Eurasia Group and G0 Media. Thanks very much for joining Euroscopic.
My pleasure.
Ian, we were both at the Munich Security Conference, but we're just coming back from we're always a whirlwind. What were some of your major takeaways?
There's no question this was a really challenging security conference. The 60th anniversary, it certainly didn't feel like we were celebrating very much. The Russia war is going badly with right at the beginning, the killing of Navalny. I say killing, it's fairly obvious that he was taken out by the Kremlin. The fact that Zelensky was there and had just lost the first major town/territory in almost a year on the ground, and that's largely because the West isn't providing the level of military support they need to defend their front lines. The Middle East, the Qatari prime minister being quite unhappy with the potential to actually make progress in any short-term deal on further hostages. The Americans getting angrier and angrier at the Israelis, Israel feeling more and more isolated. And the backdrop to all of this, everyone worried about what's happening in the United States in 2024 and the elections. So, I mean, the conversations I was having, we can certainly talk about, some details there and what that means, but this is not a happy security environment, certainly not from the West.
So picking up on the Ukrainian story, there's been really a lot of talk about supporting Ukraine all the way to victory. Some of these promises really ring quite hollow now, but do you have a sense at this stage, what is, for any of the Western community, what does victory actually mean? So are we talking about Russia in Ukraine? Are we talking defeating Russia, in general? Are we talking about defeating Putin? Or is there really just a sense that, victory at this point is just walking away with whatever Ukraine can get out of Russia?
I think we're going to have to redefine what victory means. I think that in the early months of the war, there was exaggerated notions, especially because Zelensky became such a phenomenon across the world, not just the West. This young, charismatic, former entertainer that was, traveling to the front lines, wearing his fatigues, and trying against all expectation to defend his much smaller country against the war crimes and onslaught and illegal invasion of the Russian forces. That is not where we are today. But that doesn't mean Ukraine can't win. And you can't define a victory as the West getting out. I mean, this is not a mission accomplished moment. We can have an honest conversation with each other. But I think a victory, a real victory, would be the Ukrainians being able to have a future that is better for themselves and their children than anything they could have expected before 2014. And what that would mean would be hard security guarantees by the West, eventually leading to NATO membership, that would ensure that the Russians could not attack the remaining territory that Ukraine still occupies. Secondly, Ukraine having a clear path towards European Union integration with all of the political and economic reforms within Ukraine that are incumbent upon that. And third, having the resources to reconstruct their territory and their economy and their school system and to have a vibrant Western democracy. And I do think that those three things are possible. And if they were to happen, that would be a win for Ukraine. It wouldn't be fair that nothing would bring back the 10,000 plus civilians that have been killed, the 70,000 soldiers that have been killed, the hundreds of thousands of casualties. Nothing would undo the war crimes. No war reparations are likely to be paid by the Russians. I doubt very seriously we're going to seize the frozen assets that the Europeans presently have access to. But that still would end up being a win for Ukraine. The problem is that the ability to get that win is diminishing. The window is closing, and I'm not sure the political will for it exists sufficiently across the transatlantic alliance.
Ian, you mentioned about those security assurances. In the lead up to Munich security, we saw a slew of bilateral security assurances, which to me immediately struck me or reminded me of the Budapest memorandum. I heard the echoes of the Budapest memorandum where Western countries basically assured Ukrainian security in exchange for giving up those Soviet nuclear weapons. We all saw where those security assurances have gone over the last couple decades. Do you think first of all, what's the impact of that legacy on these new bilateral agreements? And do you think these bilateral agreements with Germany, with France, with others get us to that point that you were just mentioning, to a more secure, more democratic Ukraine?
Yeah, let's also remember that the Budapest Accords were also signed by Russia.
Yes, very good. Absolutely.
But no, you're right.
No support on either side.
You're right, of course. And I think that these security guarantees that are so far provided are not adequate. As I said, it has to lead to NATO. And I think you're probably talking about something that would require some stationing of troops on the ground in Ukraine. That doesn't mean that they're going to defend the Ukrainian territory on the front lines. It doesn't mean that they're going to put themselves in harm's way to regain territory that Russia presently occupies, but it does send a very clear red line, a tripwire. That's a hard thing to do, but it's absolutely possible. And it is very clear that the reason why Russia invaded Ukraine is precisely because they didn't have those tripwires, precisely because post-2014, for almost 10 years, the Russians got away with it and the West didn't care.
Ian, do you lend any credence to Putin when he tells Tucker Carlson that he has no interest in Poland or the Baltics?
No, I don't. I think he has interest, but I also think that Putin has been very careful to ensure that this war does not directly spread into those countries. You'll remember when there was a couple of Polish villagers, I think they were farmers, that were killed by a missile strike, and it turned out that it was a Ukrainian air defense missile that had misfired. But in the immediate aftermath, it was not clear. And the Russians did everything possible to show photographs and other intelligence support to say, hey, this wasn't us. We weren't involved in this. Now, if Putin, was interested in really showing some leverage, especially with Poland providing all this military support and all the supply chain for arming the Ukrainians, leading to more Russians getting killed, why wouldn't he want some uncertainty? Why wouldn't he say, yeah, I mean, if you're going to keep doing that, then if there's going to be collateral damage, Poland might get hit. And he didn't do that at all. He's been very, very careful not to take any steps that could lead to an attack, a direct attack on a NATO country. Now, if Trump becomes president and it turns out that he becomes publicly unwilling to provide military support for NATO allies, that he's unwilling to defend them, maybe Putin might start to take some further chances, take some further risks. But that is not the environment we're in right now.
Right. That's something that was almost a contradiction or almost a denial that I was feeling a lot when I talked to people at Munich, that time is on Putin's side. He doesn't have the democratic clock. He doesn't have the electoral clock that Western countries do. Was that your sense as well?
Look, I think that Putin certainly believes that time is on his side. I think he believes, and, the Obama made this point when he was president. He said that the problem with Ukraine is that Russia's always going to care a lot more about it than the United States will. And so ultimately, Russia has asymmetric advantages on the ground as a consequence of that. Now, would Obama have said that about the Baltic states? I think Obama would have tried to avoid answering that question, frankly, because Obama, the analyst, would feel differently than Obama, the political leader. But over time, it is certainly true that the West is losing interest. I mean, I spent 3 days in Munich, and everyone's talking about Ukraine, and Zelensky is there. But in the United States, people aren't asking me about Ukraine. In the United States, people are asking me about the Middle East, and they're asking me about China, and they're asking me about the U.S. elections. Ukraine is, frequently doesn't even get a mention. And so, yeah, the Americans have already kind of lost sight of a President Biden that said, we will support you for as long as it takes, whatever it takes. That is not where the Americans are even months after that. And Putin knows that very clearly.
And we definitely want to get to Gaza and what's going on in the Middle East in a second, but you also mentioned asymmetric advantage. And one way that you even out that asymmetrical advantage is this new talk of nuclear weapons, of nuclear proliferation in Europe. And this, to me, I don't get surprised by a lot of developments, but this new talk about nuclear weapons in Europe is a surprise to me, given the history of that here on at least the European side of NATO. What have you been hearing in terms of, I mean, we know that Boris Pistorius came out against it, said Germany doesn't need nuclear weapons. Let's not talk about that. Nonetheless, this is on people's minds about a nuclear deterrent for the European Union.
I thought the more significant conversations were around the creation of a defense commissioner, likely Radek Sikorski, that Ursula von der Leyen floated. I think the creation of a common EU defense and industrial policy that will strengthen the ability of the Europeans to both be a strong partner, ongoing partner of the Americans, and also as a hedge in case the worst were to happen and the United States decides it's no longer as interested in playing that role. That's where I think the movement is right now in Europe. It's not really the headlines, the more salacious headlines around we might be considering nukes.
So a couple of questions on Gaza. The first one is, I assume you heard Josep Borrell over the last couple of days essentially go out and say, without naming them, telling the Americans that if they really have an issue with the Israeli over the top, as Biden put it, bombing of Gaza, then the U.S. should stop giving them weapons. it's not only Israel, as you mentioned, that seems to be more isolated, but the US seems also to be essentially going in that direction with its support of the Israeli position. Do you think that there is any fallout? I mean, do you see any distancing between the European position and the American position? How do you read this?
Yeah, I do, but I also think that, the United States, by dint of its incredible power, is not a country that can be isolated. It can be isolated on an individual issue, but the implications of that more broadly are obviously constrained in a way that they would not be if we were talking about Russia or Iran or North Korea. So, I mean, first, let's level set on what it means to isolate the United States. More broadly, Biden is not happy about where the Israelis are, and you may have seen that he has publicly shifted his position in willingness to allow a Security Council resolution that would call for a temporary ceasefire. That was something that he was strongly opposed in the weeks and months past, but now appears to be prepared to support. Now, that's not very much, and it's not going to end the fighting. But it does reflect both the fact that Biden is angry at the Israelis and feels like Netanyahu and the Israeli war cabinet are stringing him along, continuing to engage in major bombing and ground invasion, leading to massive civilian casualties after telling Biden and Biden's cabinet every week, oh, we're going to be wrapping up this phase, we're going to reduce the attacks, it'll be done in a couple of weeks, and it's not. And he doesn't like Netanyahu, and he doesn't feel like the military is being straight with him. So, but how much influence does the United States ultimately have? It is an election year. Israel is the most important ally of the United States in the Middle East. The Republicans support Israel in a non-nuanced way. So Biden has vulnerability there. And also, U.S. military support for Israel is about 12.5% of their peacetime defense budget. So it's meaningful, but it's not like the Israelis wouldn't be able to fight without the Americans. This is not like Ukraine we're talking about. And ultimately, especially Prime Minister Netanyahu, I think would love a fight with the Americans because it would show the Israeli people that this is the only guy that is standing up for avoiding a two-state solution, which the Israelis see as the creation of a Hamastan in Gaza. So I'm not sure that Biden has a lot of leverage here, and I'm not sure Biden wants to be seen as employing the leverage he has and having it fail.
Do you think that there is anything at this point sort of on the table that can actually either curb or stop the Israeli bombing of Gaza?
I think that we still can get a temporary ceasefire on the back of the handing over of significant numbers of hostages. I think that's on the table. U.S. cabinet members, the Qataris, others have been working that issue. There's still space for that. I think it's likely to happen, but ultimately Hamas has to make it happen. And none of us have visibility into what Hamas is thinking and the conditions that they are negotiating under from, tunnels deep under Gaza. We don't know. But I think the Israelis are willing to cut that deal. I still think we are very far from anything that looks like a sustainable peace in the region, anything that looks like Palestinian civilian governance of Gaza that would be remotely acceptable to the Palestinians and the Israelis. Also, security provided by anybody, Gulf states, Egypt, Jordan, you name it, that would work and that would avoid a permanent Israeli occupation. I don't think we're close to that.
Are you able to help us understand that bridge between U.S. and Western interests in Ukraine and U.S. and Western interests with Israel and the war there? Sort of these competing, what many members of what I don't like calling the Global South, but it's called the Global South, that see a lot of contradictions there and are very hesitant to help out the U.S. and Western powers in some of their, geopolitical goals due to what's happening in a very concrete sense in Gaza. Is there a bridge there to be drawn? I mean, it's always it's two very different situations. But there is some kind of thread there to connect.
Well, I mean, one thread is that the United States would like to see an end to the war in both places. But what it means to end the war is very different. Ending the war in Ukraine has to be getting the Ukrainians to a stable and sustainable place and stopping the Russians from continuing this fight against their civilians illegally. The ending the war in the Middle East is about minimum security expectations that would allow the Israelis to stop fighting. The Israelis right now are the aggressor. They are the aggressor with far more power, military capabilities in response to terrorist attacks against them on October 7th. The Ukrainians are the weaker power. And in both cases, the United States is trying to convince an ally that it doesn't completely agree with to move the needle towards more stability. But again, very different cases. In the case of Ukraine, that somewhat intransigent friend is very, very weak. In Israel, that somewhat intransigent friend is far more powerful than anybody else in the region. So they're very different kinds of challenges.
Everyone, you were mentioning how Munich Security Conference, everyone was asking about America and the Trump, no Trump. I mean, Trump or no Trump, the United States has an isolationist streak. We see that in Congress right now. And the EU is heading into elections where there is, whether you want to call it isolationist or Russian friendly or whatever. They just, anti-migrant. They just want to kind of, sew up the borders. What would you say is sort of Europe's position here going into European elections in June and then forward moving ahead to U.S. elections in November? What's the play here?
The play should be to make Europe as strong as possible before one of the greatest acts of instability that Europe has ever had to face, and it's certainly since the Cold War is over. More Europe is better in this environment. Following Brexit, Europe got stronger. Following the pandemic, Europe got stronger. Following the Russian invasion, Europe got stronger. You now see Europe with stronger common policies on energy, stronger common policies on vaccines, on healthcare. What Europe needs now is stronger common policies on defense. Trump is right when he talks about the Europeans not willing to spend 2% on defense. If the Europeans don't care about their own troop readiness and their own national security capabilities, to the extent that it weakens NATO and it empowers Putin, which it does, then what should the consequences be? For years and years, the Europeans say they want to do this and they don't. What should the consequences be? Should they be nothing? Because, apparently the consequences from the European perspective, from Borrell's perspective, the consequences should be nothing. I don't agree with Trump that the consequences should be Russia should be allowed to invade countries that don't pay 2%. I think that's unacceptable. Trump is in part just looking to be a bombastic entertainer, and in part, he loves mixing it up and causing trouble. But I do think it's reasonable that if you don't actually pay to support your own defense, that maybe you shouldn't have access to high-tech American materiel. Maybe you shouldn't have access to as much U.S. intelligence. Maybe you shouldn't have access to the same military exercises. Maybe you should be suspended as an ally for a while. I think those are reasonable things to do, because if you did that consistently over time, you would actually change behavior. There are a number of countries that have treated NATO membership as unseriously as Viktor Orban has treated EU membership. And as we've seen, the EU was being nice and patient, but ultimately needed to play hardball with Orban because he was going to completely stop the Europeans from getting this $50 billion done for the Ukrainians. And that there's a degree of that has to happen on the part of the United States as well, with some support by Poland and the Baltic states and the rest. I mean, the amusing thing about Trump's statement, of course, is that if you don't pay 2%, that the Russians can invade you. Well, I mean, it's precisely the countries that Russia could invade that are paying a lot more than 2%. So it's not like what Trump is saying actually means anything in terms of the vulnerability of those countries on the ground. It's not like the Russians are thinking about invading Canada anytime soon, which pays 1.3%. And there's a reason they pay 1.3%, because they have no enemies that are anywhere near them.
Although with the Arctic melting due to climate change, who knows who will come over, over that side of things.
Yeah.
World.
And indeed, the only place where the Canadians are actually spending more on their defense these days is in the polar north, for precisely that reason.
So, Ian, as a final question, and assuming that you indeed have a geostrategic crystal ball that you can consult, what do you think the world will look like for the next MSC? What kind of environment do you think we'll be looking at?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had a crystal ball. Like, I have no idea who the next president's going to be in the U.S., and that's a huge question. Right now, if the election were today, Trump would win. If you made me bet, I'll say Trump 60-40, but I have very low confidence around that call, so that's not the point. I do think that the Americans will end up providing additional military support for Ukraine for 2024, and I think their ability to continue to mostly hold their front lines in terms of defense will be there. I do believe that. That's a call I could easily be wrong on, but I do feel that way, having spoken to the senators and members of the House and the congressional delegation over the last several days. I think there's been a lot of momentum there, some of which because of Navalny, some of which because of the Europeans getting their $50 billion done, and some of which because ultimately the Speaker of the House, I think, doesn't want to see this fail under him, the so-called accidental speaker. I think U.S.-China will still be fairly well managed, and I think the Middle East will be in materially worse position than it is today. So with the caveat that the United States is a massive uncertainty, and that the United States, U.S. democracy is in crisis, and its institutions are getting weaker, and irrespective of who wins, it's not clear that the United States is going to be seen in as stable a way as it has over the past decades. I think the next Munich Security Conference is going to be really challenging.
Ian Bremmer, president and founder of Eurasia Group and G0 Media, where, of course, you can also catch his podcast, G0 World with Ian Bremmer. That comes out about every week, wherever your ears go for podcasts, just like you come to Euroscopic. Ian Bremmer, thanks so much for joining Euroscopic.
Great talking to you guys. See ya.
So 2 hefty interviews down in this episode. Let's move on to what's ahead. So what's ahead, Martin?
Well, von der Leyen just announced that she's indeed going to be trying to keep her job for the next term of the European Commission. So I think it's safe to assume that most eyes will be on that candidacy. We found out this week that she was actually pushed by the Americans to take the helm of NATO, and this did not happen because Scholz, current Chancellor of Germany, opposed it, according at least to some accounts.
Yeah,
that's what I think it's ahead. What about you?
Yeah, so aside from von der Leyen being in Berlin today to get the blessing of her party, the Christian Democrats, which is an interesting relationship, right? Because they're against the Green Deal and she's pushing the Green Deal quite hard. There's also interesting movement on the EU-Israel relationship. There are members of the European Parliament who are from member states that are far more critical of Israel than the EU overall, looking for ways to penalize Israel, whether it's through sanctioning extremists, and most recently, what it looks like is there going to be some discussion about this EU-Israel association agreement, which is kind of a partnership, lays out like what the relationship looks like, bilateral relationship between Israel and the European Union. And apparently enough parliamentarians are getting on board to at least review that, whatever that might mean. So I'll be very curious to see what that actually means, if it comes of anything, what the consequences could be. and what those consequences even would be. Like, what potential violations could they find Israel to be in based on that agreement? And of course, this comes on the heels of Josep Borrell, the EU's effective foreign minister, if there were one, saying, if you don't like what Israel's doing in Gaza, maybe you shouldn't be arming them. That was sort of the big quote to come out of the last few days. So this slow motion sort of criticism rising up in the EU against Israel keeps percolating.
There seems to be really a critical mass. I mean, 78 MEPs by the last count, and from across the political spectrum. So quite certainly, I mean, you can detect a shift in the mood and probably a lack of patience. In any case, that's all for this week. Join us next week at Euroscopic in collaboration with the EU Observer. If you like what you hear, give us a like, subscribe, or just join us wherever it is that your ears take you for podcasts.
That's right, euroscopic.substack.com, or of course euobserver.com as well. We're very glad you've joined us today.
And many thanks to Anton Shihoptsov and to Ian Bremmer for joining us and sharing their insights. See you guys next week.
I'm Wayne Glickraft.
I'm Martin Gack.
Thanks very much.